Linklater. I had to cut this off at some point. Thank you, Laura. Mind-blowing? I don't think so. Anyway, yeah, I'm so happy to be finishing out the 80s here for the rest of this year. We're 87, 8, and 9. How many of you are just joining Jules in the Wasteland for the first time? That's okay. Cool, a lot of folks. Well, let me briefly describe what this series has been. A few years ago, I was just thinking about, wow, I've been a film freak for about since the early 80s. And I found myself really wanting to watch a lot of those films again that I saw and made me, fall in love with cinema. You know how you do that with a book you read at 18 is very different than what you read at 50 or, sometime later in life. So I really want to see a lot of these films again and see how they, hold up, what they mean to me now, and also share them with, A, people who haven't seen them in a long time, or B, people who've never seen it, especially in a theater, like our new great theater here. So I want to thank Lars for finding a nice original 35 millimeter print that we're going to watch all together tonight. That's really exciting. And I just, instead of a mind-blowing intro, I just get up here and I haven't seen this film in a long time. This isn't academic. I don't watch a DVD the night before and tell you what to think or anything. I'm just kind of watching it with you, and we'll talk after about it. But what I do like to share is kind of my own feelings of setting the stage of what it was like to watch this in its day. And I will always love Drugstore Cowboy. And it's weird, it came out in '89, fall of '89, I think. In a way, it's one of the last great movies of the '80s. We could have ended the series with this one, maybe, but I'm glad we're starting with it, because it's such a great movie, and Gus Van Sant is just an indie god. And when you think of Drugstore Cowboy, I think people think of it as a drug film. I guess they're in the title. But I think of it as much like an outlaw film. And unlike those two genres, you think of drug films, what do it's like those 60s drug films like The Trip or Easy Rider, where they're kind of turning on the audience, teaching you how to smoke pot or what's so great about it. They're turning on. Then there's the cautionary drug films, like, oh, this is what's so bad about drugs. If you do it, you'll die. Or there are big explorations of excesses of capitalism. It's about drug running, or Scarface, for instance. It's, excess, money, greed. This film's not about any of that shit. It's just about hanging out with these junkies. And all they want, they're not trying to change the world. And unlike outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, they don't want to kill anybody. They just want to be left alone. Of course, there's a cop who's hassling them. But they just want to be left alone to get on to the next high and the next high. If they have to rob the little drugstore, they'll do that. And this movie, how's this for street cred? It was based on a unpublished novel by, I believe, James Fogle, I think, who was at this very moment serving, I hope he's out now, but he was at this very moment serving a 22-year sentence for crimes, I think, depicted in the book and the movie that you're about to see. And making an appearance near the end of the movie is the patron saint of junkies, William Burroughs. William S. Burroughs shows up in the movie, and at the time I thought, it was weird, in this movie, like, suddenly there's William Burroughs. He's so famous. Probably the most famous, I guess, he and Keith Richard are maybe the two most famous junkies ever. But there was Burroughs, literary and, druggie, who literally wrote the book Junkie in 1953. It's a great book, one of my favorite William Burroughs books. But, so he shows up as Tom, the junkie priest. Bob gives him some drugs. And that kind of pulled me out a little bit, but I suspect he's been gone a while now. So I kind of suspect he'll be a little more integrated in my thinking, or I'll just be happy to see him. And to me, like I mentioned Gus, this, in a way, this film, I think it sort of kicks off, you could say it's the last great film of the 80s or the first great indie film of the 90s. He really kicks off I think people are looking back at the 90s now as a great era for indie cinema, and Gus was leading the charge. We all really looked up to him, admired him so much, his integrity and his artistry. This film, that he's a master of tone. This film, like a drug movie, it could have been, kind of grimy. You could be running, kind of rubbing your face in it, or some kind of realism. He kind of goes more towards surrealism. He makes it funny where it could have been more desperate. It's kind of a tonal thing he pulls off. He finds a certain joy. There's a certain joy amongst this little family that comes together. Well, Matt Dillon's character, Bob, is married to Kelly Lynch. Married to, I say in quotes, because I don't think they have any of the trappings of a married couple. And then they have this kind of younger couple who are practically their kids. The great James LeGros and Heather Graham play them, and there's just this group of outlaws traveling around. And I just think there's such warm feelings, and it's not all pretty by any means, but it's so like superstitious and surreal and illogical and I think it's pure in a way. It just tells you their story. It's not trying to comment or tell you too much more than that. The author's hand is more artistic than, telling you what to believe or judging them at all. So I think that's such a beautiful tone, as I remember. And, I gotta just love, Matt Dillon in this. I showed Rumblefish last time and got up here and said, I think Matt Dillon's the greatest teenage actor ever. He's in name one other actor who's been in more good films before the age of 20. And I guess we have to discount Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney or something. But we don't count them. But everybody else. And I don't know if any of those are any good. But what a career. And by the time he does this in the later 80s, and he's about 25 or so he's in full adulthood. And I remember at the time, because there he is in, The Outsiders, and he was the guy in his first film was 79, 80, in those years, and it was like, which one of these guys is going to be the big star of the generation? In a smaller part, there was Tom Cruise. Well, by this point, in the late 80s, Tom Cruise is Tom Cruise. He's Top Gun, he's the best at everything, he's that guy. And Matt Dillon's playing this junkie on the run. And I remember saying, I just kind of love Matt Dillon's choices and his vibe and he's so great in this part because he's such a great Matt Dillon combination of street tough. Matt Dillon was this kind of truant kid who was discovered at age 15, cutting class. He is this kind of New York, has that kind of street quality to him. But then he's also so big-hearted and kind of has this vulnerable, sweet thing that I think just works wonderfully here. And I just think it's one of his better performances in a career of great performances. I remember this being, just thinking, Matt, he's never going to give a bad performance. Matt has fully transitioned into adulthood, and he's going to keep doing it. And I think he has. I think Matt. Have you ever seen his Factotum? He does a Bukowski. I know we're showing Barfly this one, but he gives one of the best Bukowskis. Oh well, this is the kind of thing we talk about after. Sorry, I will shut up now. And hang around after and ask questions. We'll talk. I'm interested to hear what you think, and let's just all enjoy this movie. Thanks for coming.
So, you guys like the movie, yeah?
Who wants to become a junkie?
Seriously though,
Yeah.
it sure does make being a junkie look kind of glamorous and fun.
I know. Different point in life.
Yeah.
As father and a middle-aged person, and in the 20s this was like, I was thinking, I hate to be that guy, but it did cross my mind a little bit. Just like, I've been thinking that a lot lately, like a war movie. Can you depict war and even all its horrors and not kind of support it or glamorize it? Or, and even drug, think of like Shirley Clark's The Connection. I'm thinking of drug movies that show it desperate, kind of horrible, but it's still kind of a cool movie, and you can't, it's an interesting issue. So Quentin sort of picked up with it. 5 years later, there's virtually the same scene in Pulp Fiction. Travolta's shooting up. I kind of forgot how, is graphic the word? Specific. In the intro, I kind of put that out of my mind because that's not what I remember about this movie. But like the cooking it up and all the heroin-ness of it, and that became so kind of cool again in the 90s, and then you know some people who die, and you just kind of go, you know, not so good. That said, I do kind of love the movie.
Yeah. So what are your having not seen it for a while? What are your impressions?
Open with that.
What are your impressions of looking at it after not seeing it for years?
Just how much Gus Van Sant's just such a natural-born, beautiful director. You know, just a master. I love him. You know, Gus was older. Like I'm thinking of, you know, it's the same era of sexualizing videotape, and you know, it's a big. Like I said, the '90s are coming. But we all looked up to Gus. He felt like the elder. You know, he's like 10 years older than I think a lot of us. But he had kind of lived a life. You know, he'd gone to RISD, kind of more of an artist. You know, he's done photography books and music, and he's just kind of an all-in artist. But his real gift, you know, he's just such a great. I just really like him as a filmmaker. And he's like the coolest guy too. He kind of is, you know, I don't know, the pace of this movie, you know, the extra beat to answer it in a funny way, that kind of is Gus in a way. His own pace translates very nicely into this. So, but yeah, I really like the performances and the vibe. It's all still there. I guess I just a little more like what we just talked about, a little more graphic than I remember.
When did you meet Gus Van Sant?
91, a couple years later. You know, I remember he had done one film before this. This was his first big film. He had done Malinoche, like the $25,000, 16 millimeter, no budget film. I think early in the film when they're outside the thing, that guy who's got the little knife and it's going, I think that's the star of Malinoche. Oh, has anyone seen Malinoche lately? But that came out in early '89 as well. I think when this came out, that never got the big distribution. But I think they showed it. I remember watching it at the Adobe Theater here, going out of my way, like I saw this first, and then Gus's first film is around. So that, and then I remember being at the New York Film Festival in '91. He was there with his next film, My Own Private Idaho, fall of '91. That was pretty cool. Yeah, I guess I had met him. He was on the jury at Sundance. I was there with Slacker. He came up to me, just, you know, he was always been really nice, really kind of, I don't know, like full-blown mentor or anything like that, but just always kind of a cool, supportive guy, you know.
One of the interesting things about this film is that, you know, Matt Dillon's in it, and he's a real movie star, but originally Van Sant wanted Tom Waits to play that role.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah. But I remember, I'd heard that too. I remember like reading a Village Voice. I was in New York, and it was Gus. I guess Malinoche had played, or he was in New York trying to talk Matt Dillon into it. I guess Waits that hadn't worked out, because there's those several years of between Malinoche and this, couple years, and that's usually just trying to get the cast and the money for a bigger film, which is the hardest. And I remember, you know, Dillon being kind of the star he was here, and he was trying to talk him, or he was in town, and I guess there was a supportive article about, says, I think it'd be good for Matt in his career, you know, so he was hustling to get it made. But yeah, that'd be very different with Waits. He's more, I don't know. I think Dillon's smoothness, you know, I think it works so well. Waits has that edge.
He propels the film forward, where Waits wouldn't quite do that.
Yeah, Dillon's so charismatic and so photogenic. You know, you can kind of just, something about those eyes, you can just kind of, you know, he just kind of carries you through. So, and sounds like I have such a boy crush on Dillon, but I've met him over the years. He's like a really great guy.
I wonder if we have any questions or contributions from our audience. I see you a hand right over here.
I really love the music in particular and the sound in general. And I felt like that contributed a lot to the surreality of the film. Whereas like, actually, there are only a few like really surreal moments, like kind of trippy, dream sequences. Whereas, like, I think all throughout the music and the sound gives it an unusual vibe. And like when he's burying Heather Graham, like I can't really remember what the music was, but I was like, oh,
Is that kind of electronic-y kind of
like
yeah, it has a little reverb on it. Yeah, it's kind of creepy. yeah, very effective soundtrack. Not just the music, but the noises and the sounds. I think he's trying to get into like that druggy, junky head, you know, what you hear, the specifics maybe, something like that. But it's 71 too, so it's a big period piece, you know. So I loved all the TV stuff, and I think it captures it pretty well. You know, can I say, I think like one of the coolest things at the time, like the 80s were pretty awful. You know, the mainstream 80s were just, you know, it was bad. There's a reason we call this the Wasteland, Jewels in the Wasteland. But the 80s underground was really interesting, musically, you know, definitely film and, you know, the culture that 80s underground culture was interesting. But the tip of the iceberg of 80s culture had to have been like Nancy Reagan's Just Say No, you know, campaign and all this kind of, the anti-drug thing that William Burroughs is predicting had happened. The war on drugs was full-blown in the 80s, prison populations going up and all that. So this seemed like such a FU, you know, to that. Nancy and Ronnie had been out of office for whatever, a year or two, but they still loomed, as they still do. But I just kind of remember appreciating it for that.
Also, speaking of the soundtrack, it has that thing that we don't see quite so much anymore, except in really big movies, but it's just wall-to-wall oldies sound, kind of like Dazed and Confused had that too, obviously. Is that just wall-to-wall great oldies as part of the fabric of the film. Yeah,
because especially if it's the right culture, you just have music on all the time, you know, like teenagers do, or seems like, yeah, they always have that radio on, you know, they're in cars and stuff. So it fits that kind of wall-to-wall. It fits this, I think.
I think it was before it's super expensive to do that all the time.
Yeah, maybe. It's probably starting to get pretty expensive. But they don't have that many huge hits, you know? Like if you go to 71, you could have gotten a lot of, you know, there's not Led Zeppelin or, you know, they're not doing that. It's more, yeah, it's not quite that. But
or was it Count 5?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, it's great. That last song too, the Israelites, that kind of a one-hit wonder thing. That's a great song.
Any other contributions or questions from the audience we have right here? Yes, sir, right here.
I have a question. So this film seemed actually a lot funnier to me than a lot of Van Sant's like later films. I'm just wondering, how does it compare to you in terms of like to his later work?
Yeah, I don't know, his later work. Yeah, Gus he's such a wild card. He's done so many different kind of films. He gets a vibe and he'll just do something very new. He's always pushing himself. So, yeah, I think it's one of his most funny films. Definitely. I mean, only a few years later he did To Die For, which is more of a black comedy, right? That's funny. I mean, it's a full-blown comedy.
Has everybody seen To Die For in this room?
It's still like one of the great. Nicole Kidman is so good in that. And young Casey Affleck. It's really great. It's really. I remember being like, oh wow, Gus can do that, and he can do that. But some of his films aren't so. Yeah, you know. He just gets on a tear and does whatever he wants, you know. And let's always remember, at the height of his, I guess, post-Good Will Hunting, you know, which was kind of an odd one. A script came to him. I think that's probably the first time he did something that he didn't originate. You know, Matt and Ben had written that script, and he just kind of came aboard that. But you know, it's a big hit and all that. So at the height of his Hollywood, you know, cachet, he does the weirdest. He does like what Warhol would have done if he had a budget in Hollywood, is make a shot-for-shot remake of a Psycho. It's just the weirdest thing. Everybody kind of hated it from all directions, but I loved it because I know, like, he is a Warhol guy. That's like a pop culture, a pop fucking crazy idea, and it was a really interesting cinema experiment too, because by the whatever that was, that 97, 98, you know, I don't know. Later 90s, it was, it really told you a lot about how films look different than to be colored, but you know, just, it was an interesting study to put those, it's just such a weird thing, but he's like, no, I'll do that. You know, so you never know what Gus is gonna do. You don't wanna predict or guess even. And he's so straight, you know, I remember seeing him, even when he was talking about, oh, my next film will be, or something, I guess someone told me, it was like, yeah, Two Street Hustlers, he just speaks in a monotone, like some crazy idea. You know, I remember he was trying to get a TV show made, and this is early 90s, with River Phoenix as a guy who just travels around impersonating an officer. That was the idea. I'm like, River Phoenix and Gus making a sequential TV show, just impersonating an officer. What the hell's that?
Looking back, that would have been great, right?
I know, it sounded pretty great at the time. I guess they never got it off the ground. Oh, poor River. Shit.
Oh, that brought the house down. Right over here, yes.
First of all, thank you guys. I've never seen this on the screen,
And
and as a teenager, I love this film so much.
I know, 35mm print, little scratches. I mean,
Yeah,
we are there, you know, it's beautiful.
But I'm curious, just talking about Dillon love. Do you remember a film called Saint of Fort Washington?
Yeah, certainly.
It's like forgotten, but it's such a
Mhm.
good film. I wish more people remembered
Matt
it.
Dillon's never been bad in a movie. He's good. Even if the movie's, you know, he's done a lot of different kind of things, but can tell you're a fan. Go home and rent Factotum too.
Oh, no, I know it, yeah.
Factotum. I think he does the best, to my survey, I think he does the best Bukowski. I don't want to take anything away from Mickey Rourke, because I'm pitching that here in a few weeks. And that's a great movie, Barfly. It's a great movie. It's definitely, I look forward to seeing that again. But more recently, how long ago was Factotum? Less than 10 years?
Oh,
Is it about, it's not,
like 2005.
yeah. Okay, so he did this film, really just Lily Taylor and Matt Dillon. He's just a great Henry Janowski. So if you want to see a good Bukowski film. That, and around this time too, there was Love is a Dog from Hell. Did you ever see that one? It's a Belgian film based on Bukowski.
Also known as Crazy Love, I think.
Crazy Love, yeah. Probably can't find a print of that.
No, that's a tough one.
That doesn't make the series.
Right over here.
You talked to kind of about the time period in the late 80s of the film being made. Just curious, because it feels like almost a character in this is the Pacific Northwest, the bleakness, and
Yeah.
just kind of that, I don't know, dire outlook that might
Yeah,
be.
that rainy Portland,
Exactly.
Seattle vibe, you know, that was.
Just kind of curious on your thoughts of how that might have influenced the music scene that came soon after that and years to come.
Yeah, you can't help but think that, you know, because, I mean, the grunge scene coming from that area of the country, you know, was right around the corner. I mean, it was probably already happening. It just went national 2 years later. So, yeah, that look and feel, I think, does fuel that. Of course, this is 71, but some things don't change that much. The weather, that's what it feels like up there. So, yeah, and I don't think there have been a lot of movies from up there. You know, Gus, you know, he made quite a few, and now you see a lot actually from that area.
Flannel shirts also are
The
omnipresent.
ubiquitous flannel shirt. Yeah.
Right over here.
Well, the whole dog story, I mean, is that an homage to High Sierra? You know, the bogey character, he wasn't like a really bad outlaw. You know, he had that heart, the gold, you know, trying to help us. I was just curious. I mean, I don't know.
I don't know. You know, dogs are always used to like humanize the worst people, you know. I don't think he needs it, but that dog kind of ends up ratting him out. It's a funny story because you think, oh, the dog got killed. No, the dog, they end up in jail. The dog gets killed anyway. It's a shitty dog story. So,
That's how the guys, the dog part
yeah.
showed where he was hiding
Yeah.
High Sierra.
I wonder if that was in the book or if they did that. Who here's read the book? I think it did come out. Anybody? I wonder if that element is something they cineast just kind of threw in, or if that's in the source material.
What are books?
Yeah. I don't remember it. You would think when a movie came out that they would quickly issue the unpublished novel, but was it ever?
Yeah, it did. It came out soon after this.
Yeah, I think around this time, because
Yeah,
at the time they did it was unpublished, but
Yeah.
if you want to get that novel published, just make a movie. It tends to. Oh, we have Matt Dillon on the cover? Oh, we can sell a few of those. We'll publish that. But I was also talking to John Pearson. He reminded me, there was a rumor too, like if you read the script of Drugstore Cowboy, it didn't really include any voiceover. Like that came a little later, and Gus was a little hesitant. He wasn't sure about it, didn't really want it, but I think that, like a lot of times, that kind of happens when you screen your film for an audience, and they go, "What the hell's going on?" And it's like a classic studio note. Maybe we can put in some voiceover. But I think it, to me, it works so well. I like its voice, and it's those great sections. I don't know. I never questioned that, but apparently that was, that. But I think it works great. Of course, I'm a fan of the original Blade Runner with the voiceover. I like that. So, just gotta do it well.
Voiceover's an underrated tool when it's used well.
Or in this case, it's just voiceover. It's narration. Just it's a narrator. Right over here.
Can you talk about how you came up with the idea for this series and what the criteria is for the jewels?
Yeah, the idea for this series is, well, it's all over the map. I'm really trying to show films from around the world and not necessarily, there's a lot of 80s films we're just assuming you saw, everybody's seen, so why see them again? So I'm trying to show things that maybe haven't shown. I mean, this shows, it's not that rare, but I hadn't seen it in a long time, and I think there are a lot of other, so trying to avoid certain big hits or films that I think are, and then also to get it's a kind of a combo of indie and studio and international, and like next week is Colors. It's a big studio film. It just happens to have, been directed by Dennis Hopper when he was kind of making back at a studio for the first time. Hopper gets, with Matt Dillon, I think Hopper's the most represented guy. I didn't set out to be that way, but Hopper's actually the most represented figure of 80s cinema in this particular series. It just happened that way. I think he's the only director showed 2 films of. Because we showed Out of the Blue from the early 80s, and then super indie film, and then his studio film at the end of the 80s. So.
But he's also an interesting, just as far as the series goes, it's like tracing, because there's beginnings, there's endings, and then there's, because you have some great directors making their last films during this period, you have all these new people, then you have Hopper making such a complete change in his career.
Right. Who was kicked out of Hollywood famously the decade before, and has worked his way back, and is making pretty vibrant cinema. I'm really interested to see Colors next week. I remember liking it at the time. I wished all studio films would have that kind of. But there's the titles are all over the place, but they're all films I really want. I want everybody to see. I think they're interesting. We got John Huston's last film that he did on a respirator as he was dying of emphysema or whatever. But it's a beautiful last film. I'm talking about The Dead. So you got a guy who's made his first film in 1941, making his last film. And then, you got vintage mid-Woody Allen there in the 80s. I think, I'm just assuming everyone's seen Hannah and Her Sisters and, so many other Woody Allen films. This is one that I think is one of my favorites that no one seems to talk about. So I'm taking that chance to say, hey, let's really check out how great Jenna Rollins is in Another Woman. There's so many great little moments. So, but that I could talk about every title. But every title has been really thought over. And, as always, there's a lot of titles that either it's always availability, or you have to make some really tough choices. For every one film we show, there's probably 3. When we did that one year, I gave a summer reading list to everybody. It was if you like these, here's 50 more from the little summer viewing list.
This is also an interesting period where you had a lot of small companies, like the small company that released this, who were just AWOL. So finding prints is a matter of going to the collector's market and finding which collectors kind of kept the prints. So you will see more scratches on these than you might even see if there was a series of 40s or 50s films, because those would be restorations.
Yeah,
these are ones
prints.
where tracked it down in some madman's attic.
Right. Some guy who somehow ended up with a print.
Stole it.
He stole it, let's face it. But, the 80s were, just forever I think, history's, it's an interesting time in history. It started off, a lot of the films we showed in the first section were kind of, I've always, this is still a 70s holdover, films like King of Comedy or Star 80, some of those, I'm like, this is kind of still a 70s film. It's stuck here in the 80s, and that's why no one liked it, or it didn't do well, or, it's overstayed its welcome, this type of cinema. So, as the corporates, studio thing really took over. But in the, by the late 80s, early 90s, I think that it just sort of changed a little bit. A lot of the studios had changed, and these indie, the best thing that happened, the difference in the 70s and into the 80s grew, these indie distributors became more commodified, and they just got better at it. There was a buck to be made. Films like She's Gotta Have It, and you know, Spike Lee movies, and you know, there just suddenly was a market, and more specialty houses. I think they were building more theaters, and you know, it just made it more of an industry. You know, so I think that's what kind of created the 90s.
Speaking of books, somebody should write a book about that whole period. It would be nice if there was a really definitive book that somebody we knew in this room wrote about that. John Pearson.
Yes.
Right over here, yes.
So that was my first time seeing that film, and I'm trying to process as much of it as I can, but I won't have time to stick around, unfortunately, to speak and mingle about it. So what would be one thing that you would suggest that an independent filmmaker should take away from something that took place perhaps before they were even born and they're not as familiar with that type of film that was in that decade?
What should a aspiring filmmaker take away? Go see a bunch of other films from this time.
Come back next week.
Yeah, and watch a film a day, at least. You know, no, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's great. I mean, the point is, the 80s got kind of a bad rap, cinematically. Everybody thinks the 70s is so great, and it is. But you know, I just think the 80s has just so much great cinema. You know, but there always is. You know, the 90s. So just never get lulled into thinking there was a bad era, or it's not worth checking out. You know, always be curious, and you know, follow the thread. You know, go see all the Gus Van Sant movies. Go check out, you know, Matt Dillon's first film, Over the Edge, which is one of the great teen movies of all time. It was '79, so it missed this series. Damn it! But it's a great one. Maybe, you know, talk about grunge. The Nirvana kind of based the first Smells Like Teen Spirit video on Over the Edge. So there's always a lot of threads connecting everything. So
I feel like I've heard this advice a number of times from you, both en masse and in small groups, for people who are filmmakers and who are looking to reach out and like, how do I become a filmmaker? You have said this many times. Watch films, which seems pretty basic.
Live here. We're showing a lot of great movies, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Not that we're done, but I just want you to keep coming back. You know, this is a rare, only in Austin right now. I mean, this is New York, and we're so proud of what we've got going on here. A lot of people have worked really hard. You know, the Film Society is doing great right now. So, you know, be a member, come back. We have a lot of, if you're a student, we have free screenings. You have there's no excuse not to be here. I talk to film students, and, you know, I always say, I'm like, well, I want to be a filmmaker. I'm like, well, what are you doing with your time? You know, did you come to the film last night? No. Okay, well, then you're probably not going to be a filmmaker. You know, you'd rather hang out with your friends, or you'd rather go on a vacation, or you know, you're just not, you know, like, you got to be all in. You know, it's like, but no one can make you be that way. You just have to, you know.
Seen a lot of deflated young people when he says that. It's true.
It's just, you know, there's a lot of jobs in the industry that don't require the full-on commitment, I think. That, you know,
so we'll book you in for tomorrow.
Yeah. Save that seat.
Jasmine, yes.
So, I haven't seen this film in a long time. We've been talking about how great Dillon is in this, but I was dazzled tonight by Kelly Lynch's performance.
Yeah, all of them. Yeah, she's beautiful. So great. I didn't. Yeah, what are the other in your mind like great Kelly Lynch? To me, this is the. Yeah, see, that's what I mean. Patrick Swayze. Yeah, tough, sexy, funny, strong. Yeah, it's very nuanced. She might have what? Do you think she told Dave yeah, how did he know he had drugs on him? He's going through a methadone program. You wouldn't think that guy would be holding a bunch of drugs, but she wouldn't do that. She would never do that. Yeah, being tough and no. Let's take a vote. Could she possibly? Who thinks she set him up? Sorry. What a dark thought. I mean, druggies though, you just never know. It's so bad when poor Nadine dies, his concern, and that's just how druggies are, you know? Yeah, it's like, oh gosh, their first concern is not for the deceased, their situation. Oh, I'm going to get in. It's like, God, so.
Max Perlich is
Max Perlich.
so scuzzy.
Yeah.
He plays Dave. He's just the
yeah, he's so like edgy, and he was having a good era. He was in a number of really good films. Have you seen him anything lately?
No, I was wondering about that.
Max Perlich, so good.
So twitchy.
Yeah. And Heather Graham, I guess this was the first time we saw her, but she's gone on and had a really nice run. So.
I see a hand all the way in the back there.
Yeah, I was wondering, with the use of narration and cinematography and even music, I've got a very strong noir impression from this film. I was wondering if you identified with that.
I think just the presence of narration takes you back to like noir, you know, the Sam Spade narration or, you know, something. So it certainly helps along those lines. And when you have that kind of moody atmosphere, I think it does contribute to that. But that's a nice observation. Yeah.
And the whole thing operating in flashback is very noirish too.
Yeah, to show that, to go, you know, the beginning is the end. And so.
Let's have one final contribution of the evening. And I wanted, before I do that, because I'll forget to do this, I want to thank our sponsors, Amazon Studios and Tito's Vodka. We're
love
big
them.
fans of both of those things.
Yes, they're being very supportive. It's a good time.
And right over here, yes.
In the intro, you were talking about Fogel, and you kind of speculated he would probably still be in jail.
Yeah, who knows?
He died in jail.
He died in jail, damn.
Here's the thing. He died of mesothelioma, so he probably died from his normal industrial jobs, not being a druggie.
Oh,
Or from rooting around in attics where there was asbestos.
that could have been it. Oh, I like your point you're making, though. What's that? Don't ever go get the straight boring job. That's the takeaway from tonight. Just keep your outlaw status, rob, cheat, just never work. I'm all for that. That's my 80s ethos, that's for sure.
In his life, he did die in prison in 2012 for a 2010 pharmacy burglary.
Okay,
and he had done that continually all after '89, after this period. He continued.
But he got out and went right back to it.
Again and again and again. Yeah, he couldn't stop. Well, happy ending.
He was apparently knew what he wanted in this world.
Yeah.
And was good at it, you know.
How many of us are that lucky to really find a thing we love?
Have a niche so strong, robbing pharmacies.
So tell people a little bit, if we can, before we wrap it up, about next week's film, Colors.
Colors. Great soundtrack, man. I heard that song on the radio the other day. I don't know what station I was listening to, but it had the Ice-T. It's really good. And I was thinking that's youngish Sean Penn. We saw the trailer before. I was like, you never remember Sean Penn looking that way. But yeah, there he was. He had a good 80s. You know, Sean was the guy. But really curious to see it again. You know, it was kind of Hollywood's attempt to cash in. Oh, we've got this thing called gangs and Crips and blood. Let's make a movie about that. So, you know, that's kind of what it felt like. It came out of that formulaic thinking. But I think it definitely transcends that to my mind. You know, it's all the setup, the old cop, the young cop, but it's the subculture it traverses that I thought was, you know, good energy, felt real in a certain way. You know, LA, and that's right around the time, you know, NWA, just all that cop stuff was just happening. You know, that still is LA history. You know, it's just that kind of violence and that that hatred between, you know, the LAPD and the rest of the world is so fraught, but you can kind of see it here.
So, every single one of you will be back next week to watch Colors.
It'll be fun. Robert Duvall's, you know, he's great too. So yeah, come back and see Dennis Hopper's big studio moment in the 80s, and it should be fun. So, all right, thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Rick.